I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Aspen Institute, and I am joined by two really fantastic people here on stage. Heather Adkins, who is the VP of Security Engineering for Google and one of the, I would say, sort of like founding members of this entire cyber policies field. And then Eric Goldstein, who is the Executive Assistant Director of CISA at DHS. And we're going to talk about cyber policy and public-private collaboration and government regulation in this space, an area sort of a little bit distinct from the threats that Sandra and Rob were up here talking about earlier. So let me start with sort of a scene setter question to each of you, and then we'll start talking a little bit more about some of the aspects of regulation and government strategies that have unfolded over the last couple of years. So Eric, you were at the predecessor to CISA from 2013 to 2017. Then you went to a spunky little startup named Goldman Sachs for a couple of years before coming back now with the newly renamed CISA. And I wonder if you could sort of start off just by talking about how that landscape shifted in the years that you were out of government. Sort of when you came back in, what felt different to you, what sort of seemed like it had changed in the policy landscape, and how we sort of view these issues now as distinct from when you started at NPPD back in the day.
Thanks, Garrett. That's a wonderful question. So I'm going to build upon the prior cybersecurity panel with Rob and Sandra, which is the most significant change was the deepening and broadening recognition of the threat. And so in the intervening years, we of course had the SolarWinds campaign, we had the Colonial Pipeline intrusion, we had the epidemic of ransomware affecting schools, hospitals across the country, which really did move cybersecurity meaningfully from a sort of niche issue that was discussed by practitioners and in the trade press to something that really importantly mainstream media outlets were now covering as part of the discourse. So we had a recognition that this is actually really a kitchen table issue, that we had Americans who weren't able to fill their gas pumps. We had schools that were shut down. This is something that everyday families and communities should care about. It's not just some abstraction that is happening on some network far, far away. Along with that, I think we really did have a reorientation in the federal government's perspective on how we manage cybersecurity, which I think is actually manifested really nicely at my agency in the transition from CISA's tagline as being a risk advisor to understanding, managing, and reducing cybersecurity risk. To say we can no longer observe the problem as it passes us by, we need to figure out ways that we can actively interject and drive that risk curve so it plateaus and begins to go downward. I think that's manifested in CISA, in changes of our role, which we'll get into, in getting more of our own visibility, doing more notifications, driving down risk in a measurable way. It also manifests in our partnerships with agencies like FBI and NSA to make sure that we are complementary and enabling cost imposition to our adversaries, and the deepening of our partnerships with our partners in the private sector like Google to make sure that we are leveraging the full breadth of authorities and resources to drive really measurable change.
And Heather, a semi-similar question to you, but if you could speak to how you have seen Google's interest evolve in your career there from when you were a literal founding member of the security team, and living through really the moment that Google, I think, woke up to cyber threats with Operation Aurora, and how you have seen that landscape evolve within Google specifically.
Well, I think it's important to remember that Google was aware of cyber threats, as we would call them today, from the very beginning. And when I joined in 2002, they were already thinking about this, but our business was really different. I mean, we had search and we had ads, and that was it. And so our adversaries wanted to take down our website or change the logo on google.com. I mean, it was kind of very mundane stuff as we would think about it today. And it wasn't until we evolved the business into Gmail and into kind of other things that our threat posture changed and our adversary set changed. So in 2009, when we experienced a sophisticated cyber attack from China against our corporate infrastructure, that was the kind of first time where we thought actually nation states might hack a private company, and that was new, I would say. But we had always been threat modeling and understanding kind of what we needed to defend from, which is why, for example, denial of service attacks never took down Google, right? I mean, we were quite good at that. And then I think the kind of wake-up call for us was, yes, governments would hack each other, but they would also hack us to get to the government. And that was what was new. And I think, that started for us a journey. We're now 13 years in. People say, how did your postmortem go? We wrapped up the last item about 2 years ago. Like, we're really dedicated. And we decided just to do everything different. And from day one, I mean, there were, in the early weeks of the war room, we just completely tore down infrastructure and rebuilt it. Like, we were willing to make the really tough calls to just start over from scratch.
So I want to switch to talk a little bit about the roles that you all have today, and the Biden administration's new executive order on cybersecurity, one of which parts created the Cybersecurity Review Board, which is a CISA effort of which you are co-chair, Heather. And Eric, if you could tee this up and explain a little bit what CSRB is for this audience, and why, if you are a run-of-the-mill company in this country, or at least a run-of-the-mill Fortune 500 company, why you should care about CSRB.
Absolutely. So I'll speak to why CSRB is so important, then I'll refer to Heather, the esteemed vice chair, to speak to how it works in practice and really what it's doing. One of the fundamental challenges that we face in cybersecurity is we have terrible data. And by that I mean, we really have a very poor understanding of how breaches occur and how adversaries cause harm. We sort of know what's in the first paragraph of news headlines. There was a phishing email, there was a known vulnerability, but that doesn't really answer the question about how these adversaries, be they nation states or criminal groups, are actually able to achieve their intended goals. How they're actually able to steal critical information, how they're actually able to encrypt data, and most importantly, what went wrong? What controls could have been in place? What strategic steps could have been taken in the tech ecosystem? What measures for resilience, for response, for recovery could have been in place that would have been more effective? We often compare the CSRB to the NTSB, which of course does these sort of post-mortems of incidents in various modes of transportation to say, not who's to blame, but how do we get better? How do we understand what went wrong, and how do we build from this negative event to build more secure systems, to make sure that we're investing in the right controls and resilience measures? And until the CSRB, there was really no body with the mandate to methodically go through these sorts of incidents and say, okay, well, here's the negative event, here's why it happened, but here's where we go forward in a way that is empirical and valid. And so it's a tremendous contribution to not just cybersecurity, but really the broader security and resilience of our country and the global ecosystem, because now we have something to point to say this is where we invest to ensure that we stop seeing breaches that occur the same way time and again.
And Heather, to follow up with you, if you could talk a little bit about how CSRB picks cases and what you have learned on the process side about investigating these cases and presenting them to the public.
Well, I think first off, it's important to remember that the Cybersecurity Review Board is a board of people that come from both private sector and the public sector. And this is important because you're getting really in kind of all of industry, all of nation view on cyber safety related issues. And we come together and we have a board. the selection of case is actually directed to us, selected, and then we are tasked to do that. Our first review concluded last year. We looked at the Log4j vulnerabilities that were very pervasive at the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022. And we've just launched on the second review. It's been, much like setting anything up for the first time, you learn a lot about what works and what doesn't. And so I would say, our first review, very different than our second review, and, more coming when we're finished with that. But one of the things that's been really interesting is we've looked not only at, what happened in these incidents where we could have a technical control that's better, but also where do we need to be doing on our workforce, legislation, criminal fronts, and so really taking an all-of-solution approach to how we solve some of these issues. Now, I'm a big fan of safety by default, so I like to focus on the technical pieces, but we know that you can't just solve cyber with technical solutions alone.
I'm going to come back and ask you some more about secure by default in a little bit, but let me stick with CSRB for a minute. When you say you learned a lot in the first review, which one would assume that you do, how are you approaching the second one differently, and how happy are you guys with the response from the first one from industry and government? Sort of how, if at all, do you want to change the way that the second one is presented for more impact?
Well, I think we'll wait till the second report comes out to comment on that, because we're sort of mid-flight, if you will. But I'll say that the first review we did on Log4j, one of the most enduring takeaways for me is that the issues we identified aren't going away anytime soon. And I think that message has really resonated with the community, and actually just as recent as a couple weeks ago, I saw a report, threat intel report, I think actually out of Mandiant, that showed that Log4j is still being actively exploited by the threat actors. And because of that, the report's gotten a lot of very good feedback from industry, and that actually we drove that message home really clearly. And some of the big solutions that you see, whether we're talking about SBOMs or secure coding, are really being taken up by the industry in full. And especially thanks to partnerships like with CISA.
Eric, last question on CSRB. The NTSB comparison is one that has mirrored a lot of the conversation around this, with a couple of important distinctions, right? NTSB has mandate authority. It has in industry where it's able to go out and say to the aviation industry, like, you have to do this. The aviation industry, for a variety of reasons, also seems much more interested in trying to learn from its mistakes and prevent, future crashes in a way that we have not yet seen corporate America broadly embrace, following the brilliant advice of Rob Joyce to do the basics. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you hope to see CSRB evolve and have an impact down the road.
As Heather, I think, well articulated, we are already seeing the remarkable impact of CSRB even in its current voluntary model. And I think, in fact, we have seen many companies, federal agencies collaborate with the CSRB in this current construct, where there is no mandate or incentive to do so except for the common good. Certainly, there is a potential future state where an entity like the CSRB would have more compulsory authorities, compulsory mandates, like the NTSB does, but I think it's also a question of how do we take up the recommendations of the CSRB and drive them more effectively across the community through the right basket of voluntary models, compulsion, and incentives, since we know that the reports of any given organization are only as useful as their execution. And so whether or not the CSRB has authorities in the future to direct more participation, the key is really going to be how can we keep driving adoption of the recommendations that are going to flow from these reports, and that's really broader than what the CSRB can do alone.
And I would just say really quickly, the appetite by people who are participating in the process with us has actually been very good. Because I think everybody in the ecosystem really, really wants solutions. And so I think, time will tell whether, it's 100% participation long term. But I think it really drives home the importance of the effort to show that actually there's a lot of appetite. The reason why people aren't doing the basics isn't because they don't want to, it's because they actually don't know how, right?
Do you think that that's true at this point, for your average Fortune 500 company?
Yeah, let's talk about tractors. It's remarkable to me because I think if you come to a Google, a tech company, a tech kind of native company, if you will, I think the answer is we get it. But there are a lot of industries that are adapting their very long-term business model to becoming technology companies. And I think that's a very difficult transition. And then I think you even have software companies that have been around 30 or 40 years where they're used to building software in a very traditional way. It arrives on a CD-ROM and the delivery model is sort of very static and you spend, 5 years developing the product. We're moving to a very continuous delivery model and people are going to the cloud. And I think the basics are actually very difficult to understand how you make that transition. So yes, but also no.
Eric, switching topics here, the Biden administration just released with the Office of the National Cyber Director a new national cyber strategy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see as most significant in that strategy and what are the headlines that you think people are actually missing out of it? Sort of what are the significant bullet points in it that people are glossing over?
Absolutely. So on the first point, I think the most significant shift as documented in the National Cybersecurity Strategy is a recognition that we have had the alignment of accountability wrong in cybersecurity in this country for decades. And we have tried to put the burden on enterprises that in many cases are under-resourced, unsophisticated, and lack the capability to actually defend themselves and take on the security burden that we collectively have tried to foist upon them. And we need a realignment of those models of accountability such that we really focus on ensuring that particularly when a small and medium organization is installing a technology product on their system, that out of the box that product is secure by design, secure by default. And what I mean by that really is two things. First of all, that the product is designed in a way to reduce the prevalence of exploitable conditions, right? The fact of the matter is, in technology, we have normalized this culture where vulnerabilities are ubiquitous and tolerated. There is no other domain of society where that is tolerable, but it is simply the normal condition that we have grown to accept, which might be okay if you're a Fortune 500 company and you have a robust vulnerability management program. If you're a school district, if you're a regional hospital, you're finished, right? Because you are never going to patch all of those vulnerabilities when you have more coming every 4 weeks or even more quickly. And so how do we get to a place where A, tech products are designed to reduce exploitability by default, and also they have the right security controls in place, not that you're paying a premium for, but that out of the box you have strong controls, like many of the ones that Rob outlined. We should be in a world where the enterprise doesn't have to invest in those controls, that when they install these tech products, they are out of the box and running as expected in a way that makes attacks just much harder categorically. I'll also, to your second question, just very briefly, I think one aspect of the cybersecurity strategy that's close to my heart and certainly hasn't been as widely reported as I would love is the tasking the CISA to rewrite the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, which I think is really exciting in part because the original National Cyber Incident Response Plan, now almost 8 years old, didn't specifically envision the role of the private sector in cyber incident response. Which, of course, as we now know, looking at the real world, well, the vast majority of incident response is done by the private sector. And so how do we design a national plan and doctrine that really understands the respective roles and capabilities of the private sector, of victims, of US government agencies, of our international partners, so we finally understand actually how do we think about incident response in this country in a way that reflects reality and enables government to support the private sector in this critical mission?
Eric, I'm shocked to hear you say that you think that there are some government policies that don't accurately reflect the real world. This seems like something someone should really be paying attention to. Heather, one of the things that sort of struck me in the national cybersecurity strategy is this shift that Eric sort of touches on of changing the relationship to the private sector. And in particular, there's this phrase, shifting to sort of all tools at the nation's disposal. If you were sitting in Google's seat, reading that strategy, what does that all tools approach mean for the private sector?
Well, I think it, up for interpretation, and I think, we're really eager to work with figuring out exactly what that means. Let me say this though. When we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about two things. Really, it's an equation that involves adversaries, and it involves vulnerability in technology. And if you were to remove any one of those from the equation, we would not have a cyber problem, right? You'd have vulnerability or you'd have threat actors, but not one or the other. So I think when we talk about kind of an all of tools, all of industry, all of nation approach, I'm excited about the strategy because actually it hones in even more and to refine on the fact that we need to disrupt adversaries, and there are tools for doing that. And we need to improve the technology stack to help people. And we were discussing at lunch today, and I'm going to borrow an example from one of our colleagues. They had a kind of early career professional setting up a system for the first time, set the password to password, didn't know that was a bad idea. Right? And you could easily say, oh, I'm going to blame this early career professional who hasn't had the work experience yet. Or you could say, when whoever invented this piece of technology invented it, didn't think that somebody might set the password to password. We could prevent that up front. So when we talk about kind of an all of tools or an all of nation approach, I think we have to really come back to the people who are using the technology. And think about how do we design it in a way that it's resilient. Yes, I believe we should make patching boring. It should just happen and we shouldn't have to think about it. But I also think we have to think about how the users, whether it's a mobile phone user or it's a systems administrator who's 18 and out of high school, or our kids, we have to make the systems resilient by default against all of these common problems that we can easily predict, right? So when I think about like all of tools, my mind kind of, really expands upon, how we disrupt, but also how we truly prevent at the very basic.
Eric, there was another phrase in the cyber strategy that really struck me, which is the administration calls for cybersecurity that is defensible, resilient, and values aligned. And it draws a distinction about sort of each of those three terms. What does a values-aligned cybersecurity strategy look like to you in the seat of U.S. government?
So I'll offer, I think, two parsings, that's a word, of that phrase. The first is, I think, a recognition that government can't solve this problem ourselves. And in fact, we know that the private sector, and particularly the designers, developers, and producers of technology, are going to have a significant preponderance of effort here to move us to a place where, as a nation, we are secure, we are resilient. I think the other reading of that important phrase is that we know that security cannot be orthogonal to privacy. We know that security cannot be orthogonal to all of the other civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights that we hold dear. And in fact, security is preserving of privacy, of civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights. And so thinking through how American leadership in cybersecurity, looking at the mantra of this summit, fight for the future, we can lead the global effort to focus on secure products, secure technology that not only prevent malicious cyber actors from executing intrusions, but also protect civil rights and civil liberties of people around the world.
Heather, another aspect of the cyber strategy calls for shaping market forces to encourage secure by design, secure by default. Sitting in Google's chair in the private sector, what are those market forces? How does the market need to change in order to move towards this theme that we keep talking about, both of you, secure by design, secure by default?
Well, I'll say that this part of the strategy I'm very encouraged by. I'm also very curious. I'm encouraged that we're having this conversation at all, because I think even 2 or 3 years ago we were talking a lot about, the burden is on the systems administrator, the burden is on the customer. And I think that quite misses the point. I gave you the example of the password before. But, I think we have to come back to this tractor analogy that I want to dive into a little bit. It's interesting how much we are seeing software put into kind of solutions all over the place. We talked about the energy grid here. But just things like, just basic industry, we're seeing technology stacks put in everything. And the people who are developing these solutions are making really great, safe tractors. Like, tractors can be very dangerous machines, but may not actually realize that the software stack they're putting in there has a different safety component. And so I'm encouraged we're having the conversation, because it's really going to start highlighting for organizations that maybe are making solutions that are not traditionally software environments. I am curious how we're going to do this, because we need the tool chains for the developers to make code safe by default. We need some awareness of these developers. So not only do we need, like a Google making our solutions, we need the people who make our tool chains to also be thinking about this, so that as I write code, I write secure code. As I package it up and I give it to the customer, I do that in a safe way, that I can patch it continuously. This is all very much architecture and design by default. And then when it's in the hands of the customer, can they use it safely? So I think we still have a lot of research there to do to understand precisely what it means. I think when we know precisely what it means, it'll be easy to talk to customers about it, and that is what will drive the market. But I love the strategy. We've got absolutely the right idea, and now we need to tug on all the threads and figure out exactly what it means concretely.
I am looking forward to the 2024 Silverado panel on tractor code, because as a Vermonter, the most contentious issue in our state legislature this year is actually tractor right to repair challenges, because this is sort of part of what is really changing as these companies move from basically being a equipment manufacturer to being a tech company, is they're locking up their tractors as intellectual property now. And if you are a farmer, the cost to repair your tractor is going from $80 an hour with your local mechanic to $160 an hour with a specialized sort of corporate dispatched software coder. And if you're a family farm, it is an incredibly expensive new challenge.
Absolutely, and it's actually driving an underground market for tractor software, which is by default not going to be as safe, because it's not going to have, whatever rigor or whatever regulation is covering that. So I pick on tractors because it kind of sounds absurd to people who work with computers every day, but it's a real issue for everyday people.
Yeah, the Silverado tractor pillar of work next year is going to be tremendous. Eric, coming back to both the Biden cyber EO and the cyber strategy. What are you looking for Congress to move on out of the strategy, out of the executive order from the CISA standpoint?
Yeah. So just a few words first on the President's Cyber EO, which now is remarkably almost 2 years old, but I think really was a sea change, at least in federal cybersecurity. And it's worth recalling that the Cyber EO came immediately subsequent to and was in many ways driven by our observations from the SolarWinds campaign, where we realized that we lacked the right level of visibility into federal networks. We realized that we were not driving the appropriate controls towards a zero trust model across federal agencies. We realized that we weren't holding federal contractors accountable to the right standards. And so there's really been a body of work across the breadth of this administration that really have fundamentally changed how we think about and operationalize cybersecurity for our federal agencies. Congress has shown remarkable support for the past 2 years, including granting CISA new authorities, new resources to gain really remarkable visibility into federal networks, giving us the ability to see threats, see vulnerabilities that we couldn't see before. As we think through going forward, obviously, we hope to get further support from Congress both this year and in years to come. I think it's an interesting question, as Heather alluded to, as we think through the future of this realignment of accountability, this burden shifting model, this push for product safety, secure by design, secure by default, how much we can achieve in the current voluntary model. I think at CISA, we are very bullish that by creating market demand, by ensuring that security is a market differentiator, by enabling customers across sectors to ask the right questions of their providers, we can drive the waterline for security further upward without the need for additional compulsion, recognizing that such action will require Congress to act. It certainly may be the case that as we push forward in this voluntary model, we will identify deltas, we'll identify constraints that Congress will need to act to fill, but we are optimistic that at least in the medium term, we will see both tech providers and companies across sectors really come together and say, we need to change the model, we need to change the conversation, we need to demand more from our tech providers, and tech providers will respond accordingly.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to, before I open it up to audience questions, I want to put you both on the spot with a awkward question that you don't know is coming, which is one of the things we sort of heard in the earlier cyber panel is, Rob and Sandra talking effectively, I'm shorthanding here, don't do your own cyber, go to a big provider to do the cyber. Philosophically, that makes a lot of sense. You should not be up against a nation state if you are a sort of small or medium-sized business. How do we square that with the Biden administration's general approach to antitrust and sort of the pressure that we are seeing the Justice Department look anew at big companies getting too big, such that we don't end up in a situation where we basically end up with 3 globally, systemically important tech companies in the same way that we have ended up with the financial system that we have in the last 15 years, and that sort of the government's official response is not, you can go to any of the big 3 tech companies, Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, to do your cyber. We don't care which one you use, but we're now locked into these 3 giant tech cyber companies.
Doozy. Should I go first? Okay.
We should talk for approximately 8.5 minutes.
Indeed. All right, and go. So the way that I think about it is the apportionment of cybersecurity burden is a spectrum. And on one side of the spectrum, we have many small and medium businesses, local school districts, small hospitals, who really should be doing very little, if not no, not just cybersecurity, but also just IT management. And we put out a report on K-12 cybersecurity that said this very clearly, that if you're a school district, you have 1 or 2 IT admins or no IT admins, you should not be in this business. There are great companies out there who can do this for you as long as you ask the right questions to ensure that you're getting a product that is safe and secure. As you move along that spectrum, then I do think that the burden share can shift. And certainly larger companies may have a broader diversity of providers, a broader diversity of managed on-prem versus cloud solutions that make sense for their maturity, for their risk tolerance. And in the middle, you're going to have companies that make a risk decision to do more or do less. And oftentimes, as long as they're doing that prudently, and as long as they have transparency into the risks that they're accepting, that can be a reasonable decision. I think just one more point to add there. The challenge we face today is that most organizations are making risk acceptance decisions about the risks that they are inheriting from their tech providers with no visibility into what those risks actually are. And then when there's a third-party breach, when there's some vulnerability that couldn't be patched in time because the adversary was hitting it within hours of it being released, then the business leads, the board says, well, we had no idea we were accepting that risk. And that's a problem, right? And so one thing that we are trying to drive as part of the broader community is how can we make sure that board directors, that lines of business executives, that the C-suite really understand the risks they're inheriting and take steps to drive it down. I got you about 2 minutes.
Thanks, Eric.
Heather, I will actually totally accept Eric's answer and move to audience questions.
I do actually want to say a few things. I mean, I'm just simply not qualified, nor am I the right person to talk about antitrust at Google. But I do want to say I think it's really important that the industry, when we approach this kind of security by default and collective defense, think about open standards. And when we think about authentication, things like security keys, passkeys on Apple, the Hello protocol on Microsoft. The technology stack behind that's actually from the FIDO Alliance, and this is an industry alliance. We've come together, we've created a standard. When we talk about the software bills of materials, this is a standard, it's an industry standard, we've come together. The SALSA framework, which is going to give us an understanding of the security of the open source stack. This is an open standard. I think open standards are incredibly important. We don't want any, regardless of the question you ask me, we don't want consumers, enterprises, businesses, governments to feel like there's one way of doing things in here and another way of doing things here. When you have shared solutions, shared standards across the whole industry, it gives people choice and it gives people movability. And this is another reason why Google works a lot on open source. So our container technology like Kubernetes, that's open source. Hundreds and hundreds of open source components Android, Chrome, these are all open source solutions. So I'm not an expert on antitrust or anything, but I think there is appetite within the industry to make sure that what we're building and the basic blocks of what we're building are available to everybody.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Eric, Heather, great conversation.